Moving the jobs to China didn't kill the jobs. It just killed them in the U.S.
It was really that one industry was giving us a misleading impression of what was going on in the rest of manufacturing.
During those 2 weeks, he kept talking about our future. And I just looked at him like, I told you I'm leaving. I mean, I didn't say that to him, but I said, no, I'm leaving. And when it got time to the last end of the 2 weeks, he said, and I don't think my dad ever said this to anybody, ever in his life, he said, son, don't you know I need you here? It's an emotional time.
Japan, South Korea, and Germany have increased their share of international trade in manufacturing. They have continued to make inroads in manufacturing growth. How did they do that?
Is it a problem that we lost a third of our manufacturing jobs in the 2000s, a higher rate of job loss than in the Great Depression of the 30s? Is that a problem? Well, the way that all of these pundits and economists and others have framed it, no.
Almost anyone who runs for a political office in the United States, especially at the national level, talks about American manufacturing during the campaign.
Manufacturing and people who make things are the backbone of the American economy.
And most of the time, at least over the past 20 years, those speeches include the idea of bringing back manufacturing.
I don't want the next big job-creating discovery, the research and technology, to be in Germany or China or Japan. I want it to be right here in the United States of America.
Because there's something distinctly patriotic about the idea of bringing back manufacturing, of returning to a time when nearly all of the things that we use are made in the USA. The idea where anyone with a strong work ethic can land a job at a machine shop or a factory and get on the path to achieving the American dream.
Restoring American manufacturing will not only restore our wealth, it will restore our pride and pride in ourselves.
I do not buy it for 1 second that the vitality of American manufacturing is a thing of the past.
Of course, the reason why these speeches happen over and over again is because, at least during the past 20 years, that path has narrowed. In fact, between the years 2000 and 2010, 33% of manufacturing workers lost their jobs, a rate of loss exceeding that of the Great Depression. So why did this happen? How realistic is it to talk about bringing back manufacturing or to convince younger generations to step into the manufacturing jobs that baby boomers are leaving in droves? Over the next 6 episodes, Made in the USA will explore these topics through conversations with manufacturing leaders and world-class economists and shine a spotlight on the past, present, and future of American manufacturing. Welcome to Made in the USA. I'm Brent Donaldson.
I'm Pete Zielinski. And over the course of the next 6 episodes, we are going to explore some of the biggest issues and ideas that shape our conversations about manufacturing, the decline in manufacturing jobs and how that decline has been steep in recent years, automation, what it means and what impact it has, the supply chain, and the supply chain vulnerabilities that COVID-19 seem to reveal. The retirement of the baby boomers from manufacturing, who's taking their place and how's that transition playing out, and the way forward from here.
So, sort of a fundamental belief that we had going into this project was that the health of the U.S. manufacturing sector impacts everyday people in critically important but often hidden ways. So over the course of the past several months, we've conducted dozens of interviews for this series that have confirmed that to be true, but also helped us understand some very complex challenges surrounding American manufacturing. And I think a good place to start is to look at what happened to manufacturing employment at the beginning of this century.
So let's begin with a story. A story covering decades. A story that played out in its full scope, slowly perhaps, just beneath our attention, but one that affected lives and livelihoods, affected our way of life, and unsettled Americans' confidence in our country and our economy. Listen.
If you dial back to World War II and even before that, whether it was what things we did with, getting railroads put across the United States, leveraging steam engine capability, whether you look at what Ford did with the assembly line and really mass producing automobiles, if you look at what we did with the steel industry and look what we did in World War II when we had to rapidly ramp up manufacturing on relatively complicated piece of mechanized devices, combinations of electronics and manufactured components and systems going into tanks and planes and Vehicles are being used in different parts of transportation systems. So, there's a lot of things that took place there, just revolutionized kind of where the United States' position was as a leader in global manufacturing. And really that kind of still skated through the 50s and 60s and 70s with us continuing to build on that, certainly in the machine tool industry.
Real quick, two things. First, the person speaking is Doug Woods, president of the Association for Manufacturing Technology, or AMT, which is a trade association representing builders and distributors of manufacturing technology like machine tools. Second, quick definition. Machine tools are machines, often big, often expensive, that precisely cut metal into exactly the shapes and the precise dimensions and finishes we need. The work they do, operations such as milling, drilling, grinding, is broadly called machining. When we mention machine tools and machining in this series, as we often will, we're talking about equipment at the foundation of our manufacturing economy because machine tools are the machines that make machines.
We should probably note here that Pete and I write about these machining processes and technologies for a living. Pete is editor-in-chief of Modern Machine Shop, the country's leading trade magazine covering metalworking and machining, which I also write for as a senior editor. So Doug Woods points out that throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the United States was still the global leader in the machine tool industry. But when we began to lose that leadership, it had an immediate and consequential effect. For example, if a company like Boeing needs to build more airplanes, its suppliers that build the plane's engine components need more machine tools to make those components. So if American companies that make the machine tools can't keep up with the demand, those suppliers are going to start looking overseas, which Doug says is exactly what happened.
And what really seemed to happen as we got into the 70s and 80s, we got into kind of the period of leveraged buyouts and mergers and acquisitions. It was a lot about roll-ups, what you saw was the machine tool industry became kind of a victim of that process. And so when I say a victim of the process, what ended up happening really was a diametrical change and focusing on the core technology, focusing on innovation, focusing on, innovating the next great product that solves a problem, to taking care of meeting a quarterly number, getting a return on the leverage buyout so the organization could be flipped again. And a lot of money was pulled out of the R&D areas. A lot of money was pulled away from innovation, and costs were being stripped out in order to make the multiples look good. And a lot of the industry got devastated during that period, 70s and 80s and into the early 90s, with that lack of focus. And while that was all going on, of course, a lot of, and I'll particularly focus on the Asian sector of the world economy, a lot of those countries were actually doing huge investments, doing what we did decades before in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They were now doing in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and investing in their manufacturing technology and machine tool technology. And when we were unable to, here in the US, focus on delivering high quality products that were easy to use with a customer-centric focus, the Asian countries were coming in and filling that void. Deliveries for some of our folks in the industry started going out to a year. I mean, and you think about that now, it seems like insanity and you wouldn't believe it, but that was the situation at the time. So you had a reasonably high-priced product that hadn't been really innovated as much as it should have been, with delivery times that were out a year, and people needed to have stuff in their factory to make new products. And so they turned to whatever place they could start to find solutions. And that was kind of the start of the evolution of the Asian machine tool market getting a really big foothold into the US market, which, was an enormous change then for decades to come.
I want to pause here. This is such a striking point. This seems important for really understanding our history. We have an impression that producers of manufacturing equipment from outside the US, Asian machine tool builders, that they made their way in because of price, that they undercut US machine tools because they were cheap. Doug doesn't remember it that way. They made their way in because they were available. They came in not because of cost, but because of time. U.S. manufacturers needed more machine tools to perform their manufacturing to make their equipment and products, and they couldn't wait on delivery times out to more than a year. They adapted. U.S. manufacturing adapted, and part of the way we adapted was to import valuable equipment that wasn't made here, but was made somewhere else.
Of course, there were other factors influencing the shift taking place during this time. The power and influence of unions was changing, investments in research and development were shrinking. Tax reform in the 1980s eliminated a tax credit that U.S. manufacturers received when they invested in new equipment. So during this period of time, really, the entire trajectory changed. Now let's skip ahead a bit. Here's Robert Atkinson, president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a Washington, D.C. think tank, talking about where we came to decades down the road in terms of U.S. manufacturing jobs. Basically, the bottom dropped out.
What happened to U.S. manufacturing, really starting around the year 2000, was a very serious and long-term structural decline, largely due to competition from foreign nations and offshoring, and that was a lot of that due to China. So many U.S. manufacturing firms either closed down their operations. Over 50,000 manufacturing firms went bankrupt in the 2000s. Either they closed down or they shrank or they just wholesale moved operations offshore. And so that hurt the overall U.S. economy. It made the economy grow more slowly. It had significant negative impacts on particular kinds of workers, particularly non-college educated workers who could make a reasonable living by working in manufacturing without having to have a college degree.
Robert was the lead author of a report put together by the ITIF back in 2012 that included an amazing finding showing how manufacturing job losses haven't just been ongoing, they have accelerated. The report states that between the years 2000 and 2010, the economy lost 13 times as many manufacturing jobs as it did the previous decade. On average, more than 1,200 manufacturing jobs were lost every day for 10 years. The net loss of manufacturing firms and facilities amounted to 66,000 manufacturing sites closed. In other words, says Robert's report, on each day since the year 2000, for 10 years, America had, on average, 17 fewer factories, plants, and machine shops than it had the previous day. Go to bed, wake up, you're in a day with 17 fewer places where manufacturing employees work. For a decade. Now, we talked about how imported manufacturing found an opportunity, got its start. There's much more to the story because, as Robert describes it, developments happened from there that penalized U.S. manufacturers and inhibited our ability to innovate and get ahead.
But the biggest change was really allowing China to join the WTO with very few guardrails, if you will. So, for example, there was no provision in there around currency manipulation. And so the Chinese manipulated their currency. They kept their value of their currency very low, which meant that imports to the U.S. were essentially subsidized, if you will, and exports to China were taxed. That would be essentially the equivalent of that. And so that really hurt. And there was no provision in the trade agreement to fight that. And U.S. administrations chose not to fight that. And then you had a whole set of other problems, massive subsidies. There was a very good book called Chinese Industrial Subsidies, and it just went through industry after industry, auto parts, steel, machinery, a whole set of industries where the Chinese government just lavished big subsidies on their manufacturers. And then they used those subsidies to import and dump products, if you will, or sell below cost to the U.S., putting out of business U.S. manufacturers. I'll give you one example. In 2000, the United States had about 60 to 65% of the global market of solar panels. In other words, they were produced in the United States. And by the end of the decade, we had 5%, with China having 60%. And that was all, I don't want to say all, much of it was due to Chinese predation and subsidies that went unchallenged. And by the time they were challenged, the horse was out of the barn and our companies were dead.
To recap, changes in ownership of manufacturing companies and how we thought about the purpose and profitability of those companies created an opening for imported manufacturing. The real cost differences hadn't come yet, but they were coming as a result of system-wide effects, bigger than any manufacturer, related to currencies and governments. And the story keeps going. As we'll see, the United States had to introduce its own system-wide response as the effect of lost manufacturing jobs began to spread. And one consequence, very likely, was the housing crash.
The way to think about that, I don't know what it was, 1,100 jobs a day. Think about that in terms of when those workers get laid off or the company closes, the company now is buying. So not only the workers' purchasing power goes way, way down because they're unemployed, but the company, they don't buy as many supplies from suppliers, either whether they're local or national. And so that gets cut back. So it's not just the manufacturers. Let's say you're in a community. It's the restaurants, it's the barber shops, it's the printing company that prints flyers for the company. And think about that that's almost like a recession every day. And so it was this counterforce in the U.S. economy that was making the economy contract every single day. So what happened? Well, what happened was, and this is the story that almost nobody understands, what happened was the Fed, the Federal Reserve, had to keep interest rates so low for so long because every single day we were having this mini recession. It was like more people getting laid off, not spending money. So how do we deal with that? Well, we keep interest rates low so that people, take out a loan to buy their car. Otherwise, the economy would have sank into a real recession. But it was keeping interest rates so low for so long that was the single biggest factor in the housing bubble. And so the manufacturing crisis, I would argue, was a major cause of the housing bubble and the crash, and then all the damage that was done from that. So when you don't have your sort of, it's like when you do exercises, they say, well, the first thing you got to work on is your core, do some planks. When your core is fundamentally weak, it causes all of these ripple effects throughout the economy.
So there are some pretty notable economists who have argued that job losses in manufacturing are really no cause for concern, that they're just a natural part of the development of our economy. Robert does not see it that way.
Is it a problem that we lost a third of our manufacturing jobs in the 2000s, a higher rate of job loss than in the Great Depression of the 30s? Is that a problem? Well, the way that all of these pundits and economists and others have framed it, no. This is just like agriculture. At one point, 70% of Americans were farmers, and now it's 2%, and American agriculture is even stronger. That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. But that's not at all what's going on in manufacturing. In other words, the story they're trying to advance is that all of these job losses, the 33% of manufacturing workers who lost their jobs, all of that, or 95% of that, wasn't due to loss of competitiveness and trade and unfair competition. It was due to just these manufacturing companies becoming so much more productive that they needed fewer workers.
Now we've come to an entirely different part of this, and that's productivity. In other words, the notion that productivity and improvements in productivity explain how many manufacturing employees we ultimately need. So a definition of productivity is basically the amount of output you get for the amount you spend on labor. And there are two aspects of this: the cost of labor and what that labor can produce. Other economies, other nations have lower labor costs and lower wage rates than the United States. But labor cost isn't destiny. Here's someone who argues we could have made a different choice.
I'm Dr. Scott Smith, and I'm the group leader for machining and machine tool research in the manufacturing demonstration facility at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Let's talk about the loss of the manufacturing jobs in the U.S. And I'm going to argue that this was a conscious decision. This was, so in the time frame that you talk about, this is when a lot of companies were relocating manufacturing from the U.S. to China, right? And they were primarily doing that with an argument that the wage rate there was lower. right? I mean, this is an argument that is commonly made. We can't compete against those low wages, and so it's just natural, and we were going to be a post-industrial society, and so we would do all the design work here, and then the manufacturing would go to where the low labor rates were. So I think this was a conscious decision. Now, I think that's completely wrong. I think we shouldn't have said we can't compete with low wages. We should have said something like, given the fact that there's a wage difference, how do we compete? Right? That's a completely different mindset. So,
can I stop you really quickly? When you say a conscious decision, by who and what was the motivation and reasoning behind that?
Well, I mean, it looks sort of obvious. If you're producing a product and you're doing it in the U.S. and you require some labor and you have to pay a high labor rate, but you figure that you can just take the whole facility as it is and move it to another country where everything will be the same except that you'll pay those laborers less, then you'll make more money if you do that. Right? That seems like an obvious thing, an obvious thought to have. If you're trying to maximize your profits, that seems like a rational thing to do. You have a duty to your shareholders to maximize the profitability of the company, so why wouldn't you do that? So that seems like a decision to me, but I think it's not correct. It would be correct if we had already figured out all of the things that we could do to be competitive in manufacturing. But this discounts the value and the possibility of innovation to be competitive against low-wage countries. If you look at the labor part of the cost of a product, there's lots of costs that go into a product, right? There's the cost of the raw materials, there's the cost of the shipping, there's the cost of advertising, and so on. Labor is one component, but it's not just the wage that you have to pay, right? It's the product of the wage that you have to pay and the time that it takes for you to make a thing. So if you live in a high-wage country and you want to maintain that wage difference, then what you have to do is get more productive, right? If you want to have a 5 times higher wage, then you have to have 5 times higher productivity to be even. Let's say that we're farmers and we're going to cut wheat. Okay, so one person with a sickle, right, bent over in the field can clear something like 1/3 of an acre a day, cut all the wheat in 1/3 of an acre a day. Or if you give him a better tool, a scythe, which is a long little sickle, he can do something like 1.5 acres a day. That's low-wage country solution, right? The gathering of wheat is an activity for the whole town. You can't afford any special equipment, but you have all those people, so that's what they do. In a high-wage country, you can't do that. You can't have all those people out there with sickles. You have to create a combine. And the combine, right, combines the reaping and the threshing and the winnowing all in one big machine. And now one person takes care of thousands of acres all by themselves. And it's a way better job, right? They got air conditioning and GPS and stereo system in there. And sometimes farmers share the cost of combines across multiple farms. And that's competitive. Now it's true, people who were swinging sickles lost their jobs, but the wealth creation mechanism of the growing of wheat stayed. If you don't compete, if you don't find a way to compete to be more productive, then not only do you lose that industry, but you lose the jobs anyway.
Okay.
I'll try to be technical, but I'll point out that in the same kind of time frame that you're talking about, the U.S. really lost jobs, but many other industrialized countries really didn't. Germany has a lot more automation than the U.S. does, but they didn't lose a third of their manufacturing jobs to China.
Why?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If it's just low wages, then surely that effect must have happened in Germany also, but does not seem to be the case, right? The U.S. almost completely lost the production of machine tools. Germany didn't, Japan didn't, Switzerland didn't. Those are not low-wage countries. Why didn't they lose their machine tool industries?
Hardinge has been a pioneer in the metal and material cutting industry for more than 130 years. From super precision lathes to innovative Hardinge work holding, Hardinge has been a longtime supporter of American manufacturing, and they are proud to announce the return of the manufacturing of their high precision line of CNC turning and vertical machining center products to the United States in 2021. Hardinge is proudly partnering with Gossiger, Hartwig, and Morris Group Incorporated to distribute these products directly to its American customers. For more information, visit hardinge.com. Hardinge, made in the USA. Okay, so Scott makes a point that's just as relevant to agriculture as it is to manufacturing. If you don't compete, if you don't find a way to be more productive, then not only do you lose that industry, you lose the jobs anyway. Farmers who use combines don't need to employ as many workers as they once did, but they get to keep producing here in the United States. That production stays here. Meanwhile, when it comes to manufacturing, there are still some very smart people who argue that the reason we lost so many manufacturing jobs in the early 2000s was because the United States became so much more productive. And therefore, we have overstated the loss of American jobs to foreign manufacturing, they say. But there's an economist named Susan Hausman who looked into this question, and she focused on a very specific, very narrow segment of the economic data related to manufacturing productivity. And what Hausman found was that the role that increased manufacturing productivity played in those manufacturing job losses was, in fact, extremely small. Because buried deep within the data, she found an outlier that was distorting the entire picture.
I am Susan Hausman. I am Vice President and Director of Research from the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. And I am an economist, really an academic economist by training. So when we adjust for changes in prices, when we adjust for inflation, lo and behold, it looks like for the last many decades, that manufacturing, I'll say many decades, at least up into the very early 2000s, it looked like manufacturing real output growth was keeping pace with that in the economy overall. So this was a bit of a puzzle. Its share was falling, but lo and behold, when you adjusted for inflation, it looked like it was doing great. The way economists reconciled those two apparently conflicting pictures in the economic data was that the prices of manufactured goods were just not rising as quickly as those in services. And they would say, well, why is that? Because labor productivity growth is just a lot higher in manufacturing than it is in the services sector. So they wove this story that it was all about productivity. And it was assumed that if productivity growth was much higher in manufacturing than it was in the rest of the economy, and employment was falling, or the share at least was falling, it depends on the time period that you're looking at, then it was assumed that this was automation and that labor was simply being displaced. There was no problem with manufacturing and its with output growth in manufacturing. It was keeping pace with the rest of the economy. We were doing great. Of course, my point is that these statistics, these data, which were typically published at the aggregate level for all of manufacturing, were masking a lot of weaknesses in most industries. And that one industry, namely the computer and electronics products industry, was really accounting for the apparent robust growth in both output and productivity in the economy. If you broke out what I'll call for shorthand, the computer industry, really suddenly the output growth in the rest of manufacturing didn't look so good. And of course, there's still variation. But computer industry was really off the charts outlier.
So what Susan was able to do was to strip away one narrow product sector from published labor statistics data. It was a product type whose impact and capabilities grew so much during this time that its seeming effect on the output of manufacturing completely distorted the real productivity numbers. So, a manufacturer making a computer might make a product almost 10 times better than it did a few years ago because of what has happened in computers. I'm oversimplifying here, but roughly that effect has been buried all along in manufacturing productivity numbers, and it distorted our perception of the overall health of manufacturing.
It's easy to get lost in the weeds here, but here's one important point. Statistical agencies were encouraged to adjust for improvements to quality in certain sectors, and especially in what we'll simply call the computer industry. So adjusting for quality isn't something you would do to measure the change in price over time for a Big Mac, right? A Big Mac has been 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun forever. But you can't measure a Big Mac the same way that you measure a semiconductor. This year's semiconductor model might be twice as fast and have greater functionality than last year's model. But even if the price is the same between the old and new models, it's wrong from an economist standpoint to say that the price hasn't changed because it's not the same product. So statistical agencies were encouraged to adjust for improvements in product quality. Susan says that doing this wasn't wrong. It just opened the door to a lot of wrong ways to interpret the data. And that had huge consequences when it came to how we thought about the health of U.S. manufacturing.
When I talked a bit earlier about how do we get this, what I'll call a misperception about how well manufacturing overall was doing. And it comes from the apparent very high, much higher growth in productivity in the manufacturing sector than in elsewhere in the economy. And it turns out that most of that the apparent higher growth, most of it comes from the computer industry. Well, what's going on there? Think about your, microprocessors. Semiconductors. Think about how rapid the technological improvements have been in that industry over the last several decades. Moore's law. We're just things are growing at exponential growth in terms of their capabilities. It was really that one industry was giving us a misleading impression of what was going on in the rest of manufacturing. And it was when you see that it's no longer obvious what's causing the relative and, of course, in the early 2000s, absolute declines in employment. I suggested stripping out the computer industry from our aggregate numbers, and it was staggering. So I hadn't appreciated how much the computer industry had been driving the growth in manufacturing output and productivity.
We've heard from people who represent, study, and think about manufacturing. But let's bring this home now. Here's Mike DiMarino. He's the owner of Linda Tool, a metal part producer, a machine shop, located in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn. Mike agrees that much of the predicament the U.S. found itself in 20 years ago was self-inflicted.
Okay. My name is Mike DiMarino. I'm the owner of Linda Tool. We're a precision component manufacturer located in Brooklyn, New York. We've been in business 60-plus years. Basically, politicians, they'll always say what you want to hear and then do what they want to do. That's been American politics forever.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
And we really are run by financial engineers, this country. Why? greed. I mean, simple greed.
Yeah.
You know, they stepped over $1 to pick up a dime. So people used to buy stock in a company because of their integrity, because of what they could do. Now they buy it based on the growth that it can have in share price and the yield they can get out of it. I mean, everybody wants to make money. Let's face it. I tell everybody all the time, they say, what do you do? I said, I do the same thing as you do. No, you don't. I bake bread. No. At the end of the day, what do you want to make? You want to make money. I want to make money, too. I just chose to do it this way. You chose to bake a loaf of bread. We all have the same product at the end of the day.
Okay, so Mike is great to end on because his perspective lines up with what Doug Woods was saying at the beginning. Treating manufacturing companies as financial instruments instead of valuing them for what they make is exactly what set us on a certain path, let's say. It's a path that we didn't have to take. The other thing, of course, is we heard a lot in this episode about how profit motives help drive offshoring and acquisitions throughout the 80s and 90s, which set us up for the 2000s. I think it's interesting that DiMarino sort of turns the argument around and says, well, at the end of the day, we all want to make money, because that's also correct. It's easy to look back and cast judgment on maybe short-sighted decisions, but with everything that's happened since, have we learned our lesson? Have we changed our base instinct or our motivations? I think those are still open questions. Pete, what are your thoughts?
I have a few thoughts. We can't accept that productivity caused job losses. It doesn't add up, and it lets us off the hook from facing and addressing what we need to do. We talked about machine tools. That is what I've spent my career mostly studying. And the biggest productivity change in machine tools, maybe the biggest transformation of the technology of manufacturing, came with the arrival of CNC, or computer numerically controlled machine tools, automated programmable machine tools, where these machines used to be driven manually or mechanically. And if this automation caused job losses, we'd see the most job losses as CNC technology was coming online, but the wave of CNC adoption was in the 80s and 90s, where the steep job decline didn't begin until after 2000. Also, there's the agriculture analogy. We heard it briefly in this episode. Agriculture used to employ more than half the U.S. workforce, now like 2%. Won't manufacturing go the same way? No. The answer's no. There are differences. Agriculture is prone to spoilage. It has a shelf life. Also, there's finite land area and a finite appetite, literally, for agricultural produce. Other sectors don't work that way. Think of data. Okay, think about data advances. When we became more productive at how much data we could generate and transmit, we changed our desire for data. We created social media, streaming, much more use for data. I say all that because manufacturing could be the same. With more productivity, we'll realize new possibilities, ones I'm not smart enough to imagine, for manufactured items and what they'll do for us. I come back to what Doug Woods said. Foreign manufacturers didn't come in because of cost. They found their way in because of time. We settled for not producing fast enough. Productivity is not the cause of what we've seen. As Susan Hausman taught us, we haven't even had as much productivity gain in manufacturing as we've been thinking we do. But productivity is the answer, or part of the answer. Choices got us here. Choices can get us back. There's a path, just like you said, and the path involves productivity. Relaxing on productivity, or not seeing the need for productivity, set the stage for job losses. And emphasizing productivity now can help set us on a better course.
Made in the USA is a production of Modern Machine Shop and published by Gardner Business Media. This episode was written and produced by me, Brent Donaldson, and by Peter Zielinski. I edit the show, and our digital editor is Jenny Rush. This season of Made in the USA is sponsored by Hardinge. And did you know, Hardinge recently announced that it's reshoring 2 machining center lines from its Taiwan plant to its facility in Elmira, New York. The company says that it's modernizing its New York location into one of the most advanced precision tools manufacturing plants in the world, and will substantially be increasing its workforce at the site in the coming months. Just very cool news out of Hardinge. Speaking of Made in the USA, this podcast series was recorded at the historic Herzog Studio, home of the nonprofit Cincinnati USA Music Heritage Foundation. Our ending theme song is by The Hiders. If you enjoyed this episode, please do give us a 5-star review because that really helps. If you have comments or questions, email us at madeintheusa@gardnerweb.com or check us out at mmsonline.com/madeintheusa podcast. And I'll just wrap up this episode with a little ringer for next time. Is automation an answer to the skilled workforce shortage, or is automation versus skilled labor the wrong comparison to make in the first place? Piecing together the automation puzzle next time on Made in the USA.